18 years ago, Anthony Tony Delgado disappeared after losing his family's entire life savings at a Las Vegas casino, leaving behind no traces except crushing debt and a shattered family. The disappearance plunged his wife Maria and their 2 young children into a spiral of despair and financial devastation that would haunt them for nearly 2 decades. The local community in Phoenix, Arizona, where Tony had been a respected construction foreman, was left bewildered by his sudden vanishing act. Police considered various possibilities: suicide, fleeing creditors, starting a new life, but could never solve the mystery, causing outrage among the Delgado family, who never lost hope that Tony would return home alive. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we reopen archived cases with respect and proof. It was March 15, 2002, when Tony Delgado made what would become the most fateful decision of his life. At 42 years old, he was a man carrying the weight of mounting bills and broken promises to his family. His construction business in Phoenix had been struggling for months. Contracts were drying up, and the mortgage on their modest 2-bedroom home was 3 months behind. Maria had been working double shifts as a nurse's aide just to keep food on the table for their children, 8-year-old Sophia and 6-year-old Miguel. Tony had always been a man of pride, the kind who believed he could fix any problem with hard work and determination. But as the financial pressure mounted, he began seeking escape in the glittering promises of Las Vegas, just a 4-hour drive from their Phoenix home. What started as occasional weekend trips to clear his head gradually became a dangerous obsession, with the false hope that one big win could solve all their problems. That Friday evening, Tony told Maria he was driving to Las Vegas for a construction job interview, a lie that would become the foundation of 18 years of anguish. In reality, he had withdrawn the family's last $15,000 from their joint savings account, money that was supposed to cover Sophia's upcoming surgery for a heart condition she'd been born with. The weight of that decision, the desperation in his eyes when he kissed his children goodbye, would haunt Maria's dreams for years to come. Tony arrived at the Golden Palace Casino around 10 p.m., his hands trembling as he approached the high-stakes poker tables. Witnesses later told police they remembered him because of his distinctive gold Rolex watch, a family heirloom passed down from his grandfather, and his increasingly erratic behavior as the night progressed. He started conservatively, winning small hands and building confidence, but as the hours ticked by, his bets became larger and more reckless. By 3 a.m., Tony had lost not just the $15,000 he'd brought with him, but had signed IOUs for an additional $45,000 to dangerous men whose patience wore thin with each losing hand. Security footage from that night shows him stumbling away from the poker table at 3:47 a.m., his face pale and his movements unsteady. He was seen heading toward the casino's rear exit, still wearing that distinctive gold watch that would later become the key piece of evidence in reigniting his case. The last confirmed sighting of Anthony Delgado was at 4:15 a.m. in the casino's parking garage, where he was observed having what appeared to be an intense conversation with 2 unidentified men near his blue 1998 Ford F-150 pickup truck. The truck was found 3 days later, abandoned in a remote area of the Mojave Desert, with no signs of struggle but also no clues about what had happened to Tony. When Tony failed to return home by Sunday evening as promised, Maria's worry turned to panic. She called every hospital, every police station, every contact she could think of, but it was as if her husband had simply evaporated into the desert air. The initial police investigation was hampered by jurisdictional issues between Nevada and Arizona authorities, and Tony's gambling debts made many assume he had either taken his own life out of shame or fled to escape his creditors. For Maria and the children, the disappearance marked the beginning of a nightmare that would stretch across nearly 2 decades. Sophia's heart surgery had to be postponed indefinitely due to lack of funds, and the family lost their home within 6 months. Maria was forced to move in with her elderly mother while working 3 jobs to support her children, all while clinging to the hope that Tony would somehow find his way back to them. The case went cold within a year, filed away among thousands of other missing persons reports that plague Las Vegas annually. But for the Delgado family, time stood still on that March night in 2002, and no amount of years could diminish their need for answers about what really happened to the man they loved, despite his devastating final choices. The morning Maria Delgado realized her husband wasn't coming home, marked the beginning of a descent into chaos that would reshape every aspect of their lives. When Sunday evening arrived, without any word from Tony, she knew with a mother's instinct that something terrible had happened. The man who never missed Sophia's bedtime stories or Miguel's Little League games wouldn't simply abandon them without explanation, no matter how desperate their financial situation had become. Maria's first call was to the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, where a tired desk sergeant took down Tony's information with the weary resignation of someone who'd handled thousands of similar reports. Missing persons cases in Las Vegas were depressingly common. The city's combination of easy money, crushing losses, and 24-hour chaos created a perfect storm for people to simply vanish. The initial police response was frustratingly routine. They'd file a report, check local hospitals and jails, and wait the standard 48 hours before launching any serious investigation. By Tuesday morning, when Tony's abandoned truck was discovered by a park ranger in a desolate stretch of desert 40 miles outside Las Vegas, the reality of their situation began to crystallize. The vehicle showed no signs of violence, no blood, no broken glass, no evidence of a struggle. Tony's wallet was still in the glove compartment, containing his driver's license but no cash or credit cards. His work boots were neatly placed on the passenger seat, as if he'd removed them deliberately before walking away into the vast emptiness of the Mojave. Detective Raymond Walsh, a 20-year veteran of the Las Vegas police force, was assigned to the case. Walsh had seen it all during his career: the suicide victims who chose the desert's silence over facing their failures, the gamblers who staged their own disappearances to escape crushing debts, and the unfortunate souls who crossed the wrong people in a city where money and violence often intersected. His initial assessment of Tony's case fell into the first category: a man overwhelmed by financial ruin who had chosen to end his suffering in the anonymous embrace of the desert. But Maria refused to accept that explanation. She knew Tony's demons, understood his struggles with gambling, and the pressure he felt to provide for his family, but she also knew his character. Despite his flaws, Tony was a man who faced his problems head-on, not someone who would abandon his children to a lifetime of wondering what had happened to their father. Her fierce advocacy for continued investigation put her at odds with detectives who had limited resources and dozens of active cases demanding their attention. The financial devastation that followed Tony's disappearance was swift and merciless. Within weeks, creditors began circling like vultures, demanding payment on debts Maria didn't even know existed. The family's small savings account had been emptied the night Tony disappeared, and his construction business quickly collapsed without its leader. The mortgage company showed no sympathy for Maria's situation. They needed payments, not explanations about missing husbands and mysterious circumstances. Sophia's heart condition, which had been manageable with regular medication and monitoring, became a source of constant anxiety as the family lost their health insurance along with Tony's job. The specialized pediatric cardiologist who had been treating her since birth was no longer accessible, forcing Maria to navigate the labyrinthine world of emergency room visits and charity care applications. 8-year-old Sophia, already dealing with the trauma of her father's disappearance, now faced additional stress about her health and the family's precarious financial situation. Miguel, just 6 years old when his father vanished, began exhibiting behavioral problems that worried his teachers and broke Maria's heart. The boy, who had once been outgoing and confident, became withdrawn and aggressive, acting out in school and asking repeatedly when his daddy was coming home. Child psychologists explained that young children often blamed themselves for family tragedies, and Miguel's guilt manifested in destructive ways that added another layer of complexity to Maria's already overwhelming responsibilities. The community response was mixed, reflecting the complicated nature of Tony's situation. Some neighbors and friends rallied around the family, organizing fundraisers and providing emotional support during their darkest hours. Others whispered about Tony's gambling problems and questioned whether Maria had known more about their financial situation than she let on. The stigma of gambling addiction, combined with the mystery surrounding Tony's disappearance, created an atmosphere of judgment that made Maria feel isolated, even among people who claimed to want to help. Local media coverage was minimal and short-lived. Tony's story: a financially struggling construction worker who disappeared after gambling away his family's savings, lacked the compelling elements that typically sustained public interest. Unlike cases involving obvious foul play or sympathetic victims, Tony's situation seemed to confirm negative stereotypes about gambling addiction and personal responsibility. The brief newspaper articles and television segments focused more on the cautionary tale aspects of his story than on the genuine mystery of what had happened to him. As months stretched into years, the Delgado family was forced to rebuild their lives around the gaping hole left by Tony's absence. Maria eventually found stable employment as a medical assistant, working long hours to support her children, while never giving up hope that someday she would learn the truth about what happened that night in Las Vegas. The children grew up carrying the weight of their father's unresolved disappearance, each processing the trauma in their own way as they struggled to move forward without closure. The case file remained open but largely dormant, periodically reviewed by new detectives who found no fresh leads or evidence to pursue. Tony Delgado had become another statistic in Las Vegas's long list of people who had simply vanished into the city's chaotic embrace, leaving behind only questions and a family forever changed by his absence. Detective Raymond Walsh spread the case files across his desk on a grey February morning in 2003, nearly a year after Tony Delgado had vanished from the Golden Palace Casino. The stack of documents, witness statements, and photographs told a frustratingly incomplete story. A man drowning in debt who had made increasingly desperate choices until he simply disappeared into the Nevada desert. What should have been a straightforward case had become a puzzle with too many missing pieces and too few credible leads to pursue. The initial investigation had been thorough by Las Vegas standards, where missing persons cases competed for attention with daily homicides, robberies, and the endless parade of crimes that accompanied a city built on vice and desperation. Walsh had interviewed dozens of casino employees, reviewed hours of security footage, and tracked down every person who had interacted with Tony during his final night. The picture that emerged was of a man spiraling out of control, making increasingly reckless bets while accumulating debts to dangerous people. The casino's cooperation had been professional but limited, reflecting an industry that preferred to handle its problems internally rather than invite prolonged police scrutiny. Security Director Marcus Chen had provided access to surveillance footage and employee records, but made it clear that the Golden Palace's priority was protecting its reputation rather than solving mysteries. The footage showed Tony's progression through the casino with clinical clarity, his arrival full of desperate hope, his gradual descent into reckless betting, and his final stumbling exit into the parking garage where the cameras lost track of him forever. Witness interviews had yielded conflicting accounts that reflected the unreliable nature of testimony from people who had been drinking and gambling through the night. Some remembered Tony as agitated and desperate. Others described him as oddly calm, given his massive losses. The poker dealers who had taken his money provided professional assessments of his playing style and behavior, noting that he had seemed like a man playing with money he couldn't afford to lose. Their observations were accurate but unhelpful in determining what had happened after he left their tables. The two unidentified men, seen speaking with Tony in the parking garage, had become the investigation's primary focus, but despite extensive efforts, their identities remained unknown. The security footage was frustratingly unclear, showing shapes and shadows rather than faces, capturing movement without revealing the crucial details that might have broken the case open. Walsh had distributed enhanced still images to informants throughout Las Vegas's underground lending community, but no one claimed to recognize the figures or admitted to having any knowledge of Tony's debts. Now, let me invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching us from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're interested to know how far these documented reports reach and at what moments of the day or night they arrive. The financial investigation had revealed the full scope of Tony's gambling problems, painting a picture of a man who had been living a double life for months before his disappearance. Bank records showed a pattern of cash withdrawals that corresponded with his trips to Las Vegas, while credit card statements revealed mounting debts that he had been hiding from Maria. The $15,000 he had taken from their savings account on his final trip represented not just their emergency fund, but money specifically earmarked for Sophia's heart surgery, a fact that added another layer of tragedy to an already devastating situation. Interviews with Maria and the children had been particularly difficult for Walsh, a father himself who understood the family's desperate need for answers. Maria's fierce insistence that Tony would never simply abandon his family conflicted with the evidence of his increasingly erratic behavior and mounting desperation. Her faith in her husband's character was touching but potentially misguided, colored by love and denial, rather than the harsh realities of gambling addiction and its destructive effects on judgment and moral behavior. The search efforts had been extensive, but ultimately fruitless. Ground teams had scoured hundreds of square miles of desert surrounding the location where Tony's truck was found, using dogs, helicopters, and volunteer searchers to look for any trace of his remains. The Mojave Desert was notoriously unforgiving, capable of concealing evidence forever beneath its shifting sands and rocky outcroppings. If Tony had walked into that wilderness either voluntarily or under duress, the chances of finding his remains, after weeks of exposure to the elements, were virtually non-existent. Communication with Arizona authorities had been complicated by jurisdictional issues and limited resources. Phoenix police had conducted their own investigation into Tony's background and associates, but found no evidence of enemies or threatening situations that might have followed him to Las Vegas. His construction business had been struggling but legitimate. His personal relationships appeared stable, despite the financial stress, and he had no known connections to organized crime or dangerous individuals who might have wanted to harm him. The case had also been hindered by the transient nature of Las Vegas's population and the reluctance of certain witnesses to cooperate with police. The city's culture of secrecy, combined with the presence of individuals who preferred to avoid law enforcement attention, created an environment where information was closely guarded and suspicious activities often went unreported. Walsh had encountered this wall of silence repeatedly during his investigation, finding that people who might have crucial information were unwilling to share it with authorities. By early 2004, the investigation had reached what Walsh recognized as an inevitable dead end. Without new evidence or credible leads, the case would join the hundreds of other cold files that accumulated in police departments across Nevada. The detective had done everything within his power and the department's resources, but some mysteries simply couldn't be solved with traditional investigative methods. Tony Delgado had become another casualty of Las Vegas's dark side, swallowed by a city that specialized in making problems disappear. The official case status remained open but inactive, reviewed periodically by new detectives who inevitably reached the same conclusions as their predecessors. Maria Delgado continued to call the department monthly, asking for updates and pleading for renewed efforts, but there was simply nothing more that could be done without fresh evidence or new witnesses. The family's tragedy had become a bureaucratic notation in a file cabinet, their hope for justice reduced to a case number that would be referenced less and less frequently as the years passed. The passage of time moved differently for the Delgado family than for the rest of the world. While others marked the years through holidays, birthdays, and life's natural progression, Maria and her children measured time through the absence that defined their daily existence. 2003 became the year Sophia learned not to ask when Daddy was coming home. 2004 was when Miguel stopped setting a place for his father at the dinner table. By 2005, their grief had evolved from raw, immediate pain into something deeper and more complex. A permanent weight that shaped every decision and colored every moment of their reconstructed lives. Maria's transformation during these early years was both heartbreaking and inspiring to witness. The woman who had once relied on Tony's strength and decision-making was forced to become the sole architect of her family's survival. She took on responsibilities she'd never imagined facing alone, managing finances, making major decisions about the children's education and healthcare, and somehow maintaining hope when everything seemed hopeless. Her work as a medical assistant became more than just employment. It was her anchor to normalcy and her pathway to financial independence. The medical challenges facing Sophia added an extra dimension of complexity to their struggles. Her heart condition, which had been well managed when the family had adequate insurance and resources, became a constant source of anxiety and financial strain. Emergency room visits replaced regular checkups with specialists, and Maria learned to navigate the complicated world of charity care applications and payment plans. Sophia, maturing beyond her years under the weight of family tragedy, began monitoring her own symptoms and limiting her activities to avoid creating additional burdens for her mother. Miguel's journey through childhood without his father was marked by anger, confusion, and a desperate search for male role models who might fill the void Tony had left behind. Teachers noted his academic struggles and behavioral issues, recognizing them as symptoms of unresolved trauma rather than simple misbehavior. The boy, who had once been confident and outgoing, became withdrawn and suspicious, finding it difficult to trust adults who promised stability in a world that had already proven unreliable. His participation in school counseling programs provided some relief, but couldn't fully address the fundamental questions about identity and belonging that plagued him. The extended family's response to Tony's disappearance revealed both the strength and limitations of their support network. Maria's mother, Elena, provided crucial emotional and practical support, helping with childcare and offering her modest home as a refuge when the family faced eviction. Tony's siblings struggled with their own complex emotions about their brother's choices and disappearance, some maintaining hope for his return, while others quietly assumed he had died by suicide in the desert. Family gatherings became exercises in careful conversation, avoiding topics that might trigger painful discussions about the absent member who still dominated their thoughts. The community's memory of Tony's case faded with predictable speed, following the natural pattern of public attention that focuses briefly on tragedy before moving on to newer, more immediate concerns. Local media had stopped covering the story within months of his disappearance, and even the most sympathetic neighbors eventually stopped asking Maria for updates about the investigation. The Delgado family's ongoing pain became invisible to a world that had other problems to worry about, leaving them isolated in their continuing quest for answers. Financial recovery was a slow and difficult process that required Maria to develop skills and resilience she'd never known she possessed. The loss of Tony's income, combined with the debts he'd accumulated before his disappearance, had left the family in a precarious position that took years to stabilize. Government assistance programs provided crucial support during the worst periods, but Maria's pride and determination drove her to achieve independence through her own efforts. Night school courses in medical administration opened new career opportunities, gradually allowing her to build a more secure foundation for her children's future. The children's educational paths were shaped by both the limitations imposed by their circumstances and the fierce determination Maria instilled in them to overcome those obstacles. Sophia excelled academically despite her health challenges, channeling her anxiety and uncertainty into scholarly achievement that earned her scholarships and recognition. Miguel's journey was more turbulent, marked by periods of rebellion and poor performance that reflected his ongoing struggle to process his father's abandonment. Both children carried the weight of family tragedy while trying to build their own identities, separate from the shadow of their father's disappearance. Annual rituals developed around the anniversary of Tony's disappearance, creating a framework for the family to acknowledge their loss without allowing it to completely dominate their lives. March 15th became a day of remembrance and reflection, when they would visit Tony's favorite restaurant or look through old photo albums together. These observances served multiple purposes, honoring Tony's memory, maintaining hope for eventual answers, and creating space for grief in lives that otherwise focused on moving forward. The legal aspects of Tony's disappearance created ongoing complications that extended far beyond the initial investigation. Declaring someone legally dead required waiting periods and documentation that seemed designed to prolong rather than resolve uncertainty. Insurance claims remained in limbo, pension benefits were frozen, and even simple matters like changing account names became bureaucratic nightmares. Maria found herself navigating a system that seemed unprepared to handle cases where death was assumed but not confirmed, adding administrative frustration to emotional pain. Private investigators were briefly considered but ultimately dismissed due to cost and skepticism about their ability to succeed where police had failed. The family's limited resources had to be focused on immediate survival needs rather than expensive searches that might yield no better results than official investigations. Maria occasionally received calls from private detectives offering their services, but their sales pitches seemed more focused on exploiting hope than delivering realistic solutions. Religious faith played a complex role in the family's coping mechanisms, providing both comfort and additional questions during their darkest periods. Maria's Catholic background offered familiar rituals and community support, but also raised difficult theological questions about suffering, justice, and divine intervention. The children struggled with concepts of prayer and faith when their most fervent requests for their father's return went unanswered year after year. By 2010, 8 years after Tony's disappearance, the family had achieved a new kind of stability that was built around his absence rather than his presence. They had learned to function as a unit of three, developing their own traditions and support systems that didn't depend on external validation or resolution of their primary trauma. While they never stopped hoping for answers, they had also stopped allowing that hope to prevent them from building meaningful lives in the present. The phone call that would resurrect Tony Delgado's cold case came on a sweltering August afternoon in 2020. 18 years after his disappearance had shattered his family's world. Detective Sarah Martinez, a 15-year veteran of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police, who had inherited dozens of cold cases from retiring colleagues, almost didn't take the call from the pawn shop owner downtown. Vincent "Vinny" Torino wasn't exactly known for his cooperation with law enforcement, running a business that existed in the grey areas where legitimate commerce met the city's darker enterprises. But something in Vinny's voice suggested this wasn't another routine tip about stolen merchandise or suspicious customers. The 68-year-old pawnshop owner, whose establishment had weathered decades of Las Vegas's evolution, from mob-controlled gambling destination to corporate entertainment empire, claimed to have information about a missing person case from 2002. When he mentioned Tony Delgado's name and described a distinctive gold Rolex watch, Martinez felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with potentially significant developments in long-dormant cases. Vinny's shop, located in a rundown section of downtown Las Vegas that had resisted the city's ongoing gentrification efforts, served as an unofficial clearinghouse for items that changed hands in the shadows of the city's official economy. Over the years, he had developed relationships with loan sharks, small-time criminals, and desperate gamblers who used his services to convert assets into quick cash or store items they couldn't afford to be found possessing. His clientele valued discretion above all else, and Vinny had built his reputation on asking few questions and keeping his mouth shut about his customers' business. The watch that had prompted his call to police was indeed distinctive, a 1970s Rolex Submariner with custom engraving on the back that read, "Para Anthony con amor de abuelo," in elegant script. The Spanish inscription, which translated to "For Anthony with love from grandfather," matched exactly the description Maria had provided to police in 2002. The timepiece had been given to Tony on his 18th birthday by his grandfather, who had saved for months to purchase what he hoped would become a family heirloom passed down through generations. According to Vinny, the watch had been brought to his shop 3 days earlier by two men he recognized as enforcers for a mid-level loan shark named Eddie Marchetti. Marchetti operated out of a used car lot on the outskirts of the city, providing high-interest loans to gamblers who had exhausted traditional credit sources. His business model was simple but effective: charge enormous interest rates, use intimidation to ensure payment, and occasionally resort to violence when other methods failed to produce results. The men who brought the watch had claimed it was payment for a long-standing debt, part of a collection effort that had finally succeeded after years of patient pursuit. Vinny had initially been reluctant to accept the piece, recognizing its potential value, but also understanding that expensive jewelry often came with complicated histories. However, the men had been persuasive, and the watch's obvious value made it difficult for a businessman like Vinny to refuse such a lucrative opportunity. What changed Vinny's perspective was a conversation with his nephew, a Las Vegas police officer who occasionally visited the shop to check on his uncle's well-being and maintain informal connections with the community. During a casual discussion about memorable cases, the nephew had mentioned the Delgado disappearance and the distinctive Rolex that had never been recovered. The description had immediately triggered Vinny's memory, causing him to reconsider his recent acquisition and its possible significance to a case he remembered from the early days of his nephew's career. Detective Martinez's interview with Vinny revealed additional details that added urgency to the renewed investigation. The loan sharks who had brought the watch had seemed nervous and eager to complete the transaction quickly, suggesting they were looking to dispose of evidence rather than simply liquidate assets. Their behavior had been unusual, even by the standards of Vinny's typically cautious clientele, who generally preferred to maintain ongoing relationships rather than conducting one-time transactions. The connection to Eddie Marchetti provided the first concrete lead the case had seen in nearly 2 decades. Marchetti was known to police as a small-time operator who had managed to avoid serious legal trouble through a combination of careful business practices and strategic information sharing. His loan operation catered primarily to gamblers who had exhausted traditional credit sources, offering cash advances against future earnings or valuable personal property. While his interest rates were excessive and his collection methods sometimes crossed legal boundaries, he had generally avoided the violent reputation that characterized more serious criminal enterprises. Investigation into Marchetti's business records proved challenging, as he maintained minimal paperwork and conducted most transactions through cash payments and verbal agreements. However, police were able to establish that his operation had been active in 2002 and that he had frequently conducted business in and around the Golden Palace Casino, where Tony had lost his final bet. The timeline was suspicious enough to warrant further investigation, particularly given the 18-year gap between Tony's disappearance and the watch's appearance at Vinny's shop. Martinez began building a case file that connected Tony's gambling debts to Marchetti's operation, seeking to establish whether the missing man had borrowed money from the loan shark during his final trip to Las Vegas. Casino records from 2002 were difficult to access due to privacy concerns and the passage of time, but security logs showed that Marchetti's known associates had been present at the Golden Palace on the night of Tony's disappearance. The circumstantial evidence was mounting, but proved frustratingly short of the concrete proof needed to justify arrests or search warrants. The recovery of Tony's watch also raised troubling questions about why it had suddenly surfaced after remaining hidden for 18 years. The timing suggested either that someone had been holding on to the piece for nearly 2 decades before deciding to sell it, or that recent events had forced its current owners to liquidate assets quickly. Both possibilities implied ongoing criminal activity and suggested that people connected to Tony's disappearance might still be operating in Las Vegas's underground economy. For Maria Delgado, now 58 years old and working as a hospital administrator in Phoenix, the news about her husband's watch represented both hope and renewed anguish. The confirmation that Tony's most prized possession had survived his disappearance suggested that his fate might finally be discoverable, but it also meant confronting painful realities about what might have happened to him during those final hours in Las Vegas. The watch had been more than jewelry to Tony. It was a symbol of family legacy and personal identity that he would never have voluntarily surrendered. Sofia and Miguel, now adults building their own lives while carrying the permanent scars of their father's disappearance, reacted to the news with complex emotions that reflected their 18-year journey through grief and uncertainty. The possibility of finally learning the truth about their father's fate was both thrilling and terrifying, offering potential closure while also threatening to disrupt the stability they had worked so hard to achieve in their adult lives. Detective Martinez's investigation into Eddie Marchetti's loan operation revealed a complex web of financial relationships that had operated in Las Vegas's shadows for decades, preying on desperate gamblers and facilitating the kind of high-stakes transactions that rarely appeared in official records. Marchetti's used car lot served as the legitimate front for a business that generated most of its profits through illegal lending, with interest rates that could exceed 300% annually, and collection methods that sometimes involved intimidation, theft, and violence. The loan shark's operation had evolved significantly since 2002, adapting to changes in Las Vegas's economy and law enforcement priorities, while maintaining its core function as a lender of last resort for people who had exhausted traditional credit sources. Marchetti had survived by maintaining a lower profile than more ambitious criminals, focusing on steady profits rather than territorial expansion, and avoiding the attention that came with high-profile violence or conflicts with organized crime families. Surveillance of Marchetti's business revealed a steady stream of customers who arrived at odd hours, conducted brief meetings in the back office, and left carrying cash or valuable items. The loan shark had developed sophisticated systems for evaluating collateral and assessing the creditworthiness of potential borrowers, relying on a network of informants within casinos, pawn shops, and other businesses that served gamblers. His ability to quickly verify a person's assets and debts had made him a valuable resource for people who needed money immediately and couldn't wait for traditional loan approval processes. The two enforcers who had brought Tony's watch to Vinny's pawn shop were identified as Marcus Webb and Danny Costello, longtime associates of Marchetti who specialized in debt collection and asset recovery. Webb, a former casino security guard, had been arrested multiple times for assault, but had avoided serious prison time through plea bargains and strategic cooperation with prosecutors. Costello had a background in repossessing vehicles and other property, skills that had proven valuable in the loan shark business, where collateral often needed to be seized from unwilling debtors. Interviews with Webb and Costello proved frustratingly unproductive, as both men claimed to have no specific memory of acquiring Tony's watch or knowledge of how it had come into Marchetti's possession. Their stories were consistent but vague, describing the Rolex as part of a collection of items that had been accumulating in Marchetti's safe for years. They claimed to have been instructed to liquidate various pieces of jewelry and valuable goods as part of a general effort to convert assets into cash, but couldn't provide details about the original sources of individual items. The investigation's breakthrough came through financial records that Marchetti had been required to maintain for his legitimate used car business, which occasionally intersected with his illegal lending operation when vehicles served as collateral for loans. Analysis of these records revealed patterns of suspicious transactions that corresponded with known gambling events and casino promotions, suggesting that Marchetti had timed his lending activities to coincide with periods when desperate gamblers were most likely to seek high-interest loans. If this case has already hooked you, hit the like button. This helps Anthony's story reach more people. Bank surveillance footage from March 2002, preserved in archives that had been transferred to digital storage, showed Tony making his final withdrawal of $15,000 from the family savings account. The timestamp revealed that he had conducted this transaction just hours before arriving in Las Vegas, suggesting that his decision to gamble the money had been premeditated rather than spontaneous. This evidence contradicted Maria's belief that Tony's final trip had been motivated by a genuine job opportunity, instead supporting the theory that he had been planning one desperate attempt to solve their financial problems through gambling. The investigation also uncovered connections between Marchetti's operation and several other unsolved disappearances from the early 2000s, suggesting a pattern of violence that extended beyond Tony's case. 3 other missing persons reports from that period involved men who had accumulated significant gambling debts and had been seen in the company of known loan sharks shortly before their disappearances. While these cases lacked the physical evidence provided by Tony's watch, the similarities were too striking to ignore. Pressure on Marchetti's organization intensified when police executed search warrants on his used car lot and personal residence, seeking evidence related to Tony's disappearance and the other suspicious cases. The searches revealed a sophisticated record-keeping system that documented loans, interest payments, and collection activities in coded language that required expert analysis to decipher. Hidden safes contained thousands of dollars in cash, along with jewelry, watches, and other valuable items that had been accepted as collateral or seized from debtors. Among the seized items were several pieces of jewelry that matched descriptions from other missing persons cases, including a distinctive class ring and a gold chain that families had reported missing along with their loved ones. These discoveries suggested that Marchetti's operation had been systematically collecting valuable personal items from victims, either as collateral for unpaid loans or as trophies taken during violent confrontations. The loan shark's legal strategy relied on claims of legitimate business practices and lack of direct involvement in any violent activities. His attorneys argued that Marchetti simply provided financial services to consenting adults, and that any violence or criminal activity had been conducted by rogue associates, acting without his knowledge or authorization. This defense was complicated by the evidence of systematic record-keeping and the sophisticated nature of his operation, which suggested a level of organization that was inconsistent with claims of innocent business practices. Cooperation from other members of Marchetti's network proved limited, as most associates had their own criminal exposure and were reluctant to provide information that might implicate them in serious felonies. The code of silence that characterized Las Vegas's underground economy meant that even people with crucial information were unlikely to voluntarily assist law enforcement, particularly in cases that might expose them to retaliation from other criminal organizations. The investigation revealed that Tony's debt to Marchetti had likely exceeded $50,000 by the time of his disappearance, based on the $45,000 in IOUs he had signed at the casino, plus interest and penalties that had accumulated during the hours between his gambling losses and his meeting with loan shark representatives. This amount represented a substantial sum for Marchetti's operation, enough to justify aggressive collection efforts and potentially violent responses to non-payment. Electronic surveillance of Marchetti's communications during the investigation period captured conversations that suggested ongoing criminal activity but stopped short of providing direct evidence of involvement in Tony's disappearance. The loan shark's careful language and use of coded references reflected his experience in avoiding law enforcement detection, making it difficult to build cases based solely on recorded conversations. Forensic analysis of Tony's watch revealed trace evidence that had survived 18 years of handling and storage, including DNA samples that were too degraded for individual identification, but suggested contact with multiple people. The watch's condition indicated that it had been carefully stored rather than worn regularly, supporting theories that it had been retained as evidence of successful collection rather than sold immediately after Tony's disappearance. The psychological pressure of the investigation began affecting members of Marchetti's organization, as the possibility of murder charges created incentives for cooperation that hadn't existed when the case was treated as a simple missing person matter. Several associates hired independent legal representation and began exploring plea bargain opportunities, suggesting that the unified front of silence might be beginning to crack under the weight of potential life sentences. The psychological pressure of 18 months of intense investigation finally began fracturing the wall of silence that had protected Eddie Marchetti's organization since Tony Delgado's disappearance in 2002. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Danny Costello's ex-wife, Rebecca, who had been bitter about their divorce settlement and nursing resentments that made her receptive to law enforcement overtures. Her insider knowledge of Costello's activities and her access to private conversations provided investigators with the leverage they needed to begin dismantling the network of lies that had concealed the truth for nearly 2 decades. Rebecca Costello had divorced Danny in 2018 after discovering his involvement in a series of violent debt collection incidents that had left her fearful for her own safety and that of their teenage daughter. During their marriage, she had witnessed conversations and activities that she had tried to ignore, but the police investigation had forced her to confront the reality of her ex-husband's criminal activities. Her decision to cooperate with authorities was motivated by a combination of civic duty, personal safety concerns, and a desire for revenge against the man who had endangered their family through his criminal associations. The information Rebecca provided painted a disturbing picture of Marchetti's operation during the early 2000s, when the organization had been more violent and less disciplined than its later incarnation. According to her testimony, Danny had frequently boasted about confrontations with debtors who refused to pay, describing incidents of intimidation and violence with a casualness that had horrified his wife. She recalled specific conversations about a construction worker from Arizona who had learned his lesson the hard way after trying to skip out on his debts to the organization. Detective Martinez used Rebecca's information to build a case for separating Danny Costello from his more experienced associates, creating opportunities for individual interrogation sessions that might yield better results than previous group interviews. Costello's criminal record and family situation made him vulnerable to prosecution strategies that emphasized his role as a family man who had gotten involved with dangerous people, potentially offering him reduced sentences in exchange for truthful testimony about historical cases. The strategy proved effective when Costello's attorney advised him that cooperation might be his only chance to avoid life imprisonment on murder charges that were being prepared by the district attorney's office. Faced with the possibility of never seeing his daughter graduate from high school or college, Costello began providing details about debt collection activities that had occurred during his early years with Marchetti's organization. His account of Tony Delgado's final night revealed a sequence of events that was both tragic and predictable, showing how a desperate gambler's poor decisions had led him into the path of people who viewed violence as a routine business practice. According to Costello's testimony, Tony had initially approached Marchetti's representatives at the Golden Palace Casino around 2 a.m., seeking a loan that would allow him to continue gambling after losing his original $15,000 stake. The loan sharks had been immediately suspicious of his desperation and obvious inexperience with high-stakes borrowing, but Tony's expensive watch and his willingness to sign blank IOUs had convinced them to advance him the additional $45,000 he needed to stay in the game. When Tony lost that money as well, his debt to Marchetti's organization had ballooned to more than $60,000 when interest and penalties were included. The loan sharks had given him until sunrise to produce either cash or additional collateral, a deadline that Tony had been unable to meet despite frantic calls to friends and family members who had no knowledge of his gambling problems. His desperation had been obvious to everyone around him, creating a situation that experienced criminals recognized as potentially dangerous to their operations' security. The meeting in the casino parking garage had been intended as a final collection attempt, with Webb and Costello instructed to recover whatever assets they could and arrange a payment plan for the remaining debt. However, Tony's emotional breakdown and threats to expose their operation to police had escalated the situation beyond what anyone had anticipated. His declaration that he would rather die than return home to face his family's financial ruin had been interpreted as both a suicide threat and a potential security risk that required immediate response. Costello's account of what happened next was delivered in the flat, emotionless tone of someone recounting events he had spent 18 years trying to forget. According to his testimony, Webb had struck Tony during an argument about the watch, causing him to fall and hit his head on the concrete parking garage floor. The injury had been severe enough to cause immediate unconsciousness, leaving the two enforcers with a critically injured man and no clear plan for dealing with the situation. Rather than calling for medical assistance, which would have exposed their illegal lending operation to police scrutiny, Webb and Costello had made the decision to transport Tony to a remote location where they could assess his condition without risking arrest. They had driven his truck to the desert location where it was later found, with Tony unconscious in the passenger seat and his condition deteriorating during the journey. By the time they reached the isolated area, Tony had died from his head injury, leaving them with a body to dispose of and a crime to conceal. The disposal of Tony's remains had been carried out with the efficiency that came from experience. According to Costello's testimony, the body had been buried in a location known to the organization for its remoteness and geological characteristics that would accelerate decomposition. Tony's personal effects, including his distinctive watch and wallet, had been retained by Webb as proof of the successful collection and as potential evidence that could be used to ensure Costello's continued silence about the incident. The revelation that Tony's death had been accidental rather than premeditated murder provided little comfort to his family, who had spent 18 years wondering whether their husband and father had suffered during his final moments. The knowledge that he had died from a head injury during a confrontation about money he had stolen from their children's medical fund added layers of tragedy and complexity to their long-delayed grief process. Costello's cooperation also revealed the location where Tony's remains had been buried, a remote area of the Mojave Desert approximately 60 miles from Las Vegas. The site had been chosen for its isolation and its geological characteristics, which the criminals had believed would ensure that the body would never be discovered. However, recent development in the area had brought construction equipment and workers closer to the burial location, creating risks of accidental discovery that had motivated the organization's recent efforts to liquidate evidence. The decision to finally sell Tony's watch after 18 years of storage had been driven by practical rather than sentimental considerations, according to Costello's account. Webb had been diagnosed with terminal cancer and was facing significant medical expenses that required liquidating assets quickly. His deteriorating health had also made him less reliable as a keeper of criminal secrets, creating additional incentives for disposing of evidence that connected him to historical crimes. For Detective Martinez, Costello's confession represented both a professional triumph and a personal tragedy, solving a case that had haunted the department for nearly 2 decades while revealing the senseless nature of Tony's death. The man who had driven to Las Vegas hoping to solve his family's financial problems had instead become the victim of a crime that had been motivated by greed rather than genuine malice, dying because criminals had prioritized their own safety over human life. The legal implications of Costello's testimony were significant, but complicated by the passage of time and the accidental nature of Tony's death. Murder charges were still possible for Webb, who had struck the fatal blow, but prosecuting an 18-year-old case presented challenges that would require careful preparation and strategic decision-making by the district attorney's office. The excavation team assembled in the pre-dawn darkness of a November morning in 2021, their headlights cutting through the desert silence as they prepared to uncover secrets that had been buried for 19 years. The location Danny Costello had identified was a desolate stretch of the Mojave Desert, 60 miles northeast of Las Vegas, where rocky outcroppings and sparse vegetation created a landscape that seemed designed for concealing evidence. Detective Martinez had spent weeks coordinating with forensic specialists, medical examiners, and search teams to ensure that the recovery operation would preserve whatever evidence might remain after nearly 2 decades of exposure to the harsh desert environment. The site itself was marked only by Costello's detailed description and GPS coordinates that he had memorized during the original burial in 2002. According to his testimony, the location had been chosen for its geological characteristics: hard-packed earth covered by a layer of rocky soil that would discourage casual digging while providing natural camouflage for disturbed ground. The criminals had also selected an area that was unlikely to attract development or recreational activity, ensuring that the grave would remain undisturbed for years or possibly decades. Ground-penetrating radar had confirmed the presence of anomalies beneath the surface that were consistent with human burial, providing scientific validation for Costello's claims while also revealing the approximate depth and dimensions of what lay buried. The technology showed a clearly defined rectangular depression, approximately 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, buried at a depth that suggested both haste and some level of planning in the original disposal effort. Dr. Amanda Foster, a forensic anthropologist who had assisted with similar recoveries throughout the Southwest, supervised the excavation process with meticulous attention to detail that reflected the importance of preserving evidence for potential prosecution. Every shovelful of dirt was carefully sifted and examined, while photographers documented each stage of the process to create a comprehensive record that could be presented in court. The work was slow and painstaking, requiring hours of careful digging before the first traces of human remains became visible. The discovery of Tony's remains was both a moment of triumph and profound sadness for the recovery team, confirming that the long investigation had finally reached its conclusion, while also confronting them with the physical reality of his death. The skeleton was remarkably well preserved considering the passage of time, protected by the dry desert climate and the depth of burial that had shielded it from scavengers and surface disturbances. Fragments of clothing and personal effects were scattered throughout the grave, providing additional evidence that supported Costello's account of the events leading to Tony's death. Forensic analysis of the skeletal remains revealed evidence consistent with the head trauma that Costello had described, including fractures to the skull that indicated a significant impact followed by internal bleeding that would have been fatal without immediate medical intervention. The pattern of injuries supported the claim that Tony's death had resulted from falling and striking his head on concrete rather than from deliberate assault with a weapon or other forms of violence. The condition of Tony's remains also provided insights into the circumstances of his burial, suggesting that the criminals had wrapped his body in plastic sheeting before interment. Traces of this material were still detectable around the skeleton, along with fragments of rope that had apparently been used to secure the makeshift shroud. The careful packaging indicated that Webb and Costello had taken some precautions to prevent decomposition odors from attracting attention, while also facilitating the transport and burial process. Personal effects recovered from the grave included Tony's wallet, which still contained his driver's license and credit cards, along with fragments of his clothing and a distinctive belt buckle that Maria immediately recognized when shown photographs. The presence of these items contradicted theories that Tony had been robbed or that his disappearance had been motivated by financial gain rather than the need to conceal evidence of accidental death. The recovery of Tony's remains provided closure for the Delgado family after 19 years of uncertainty, but also forced them to confront painful details about his final hours that they might have preferred not to know. Maria's initial relief at finally learning her husband's fate was tempered by anger about the circumstances of his death and the decades of lies that had concealed the truth from his family. The knowledge that Tony had died alone and afraid, far from the people who loved him, added another dimension to their long-delayed grief process. Sofia and Miguel's reactions to the discovery reflected their different relationships with their father's memory and their varying approaches to processing trauma. Sofia, who had always maintained hope that Tony might someday return, found some comfort in finally having definitive answers about his fate. Miguel, whose anger about his father's abandonment had shaped much of his adult life, struggled with complex emotions that included relief, sadness, and continued resentment about the choices that had led to Tony's death. The forensic investigation also revealed evidence that supported other aspects of Costello's testimony, including traces of desert sand and plant material that matched samples from the area around the Golden Palace Casino. This evidence suggested that Tony's body had been transported directly from Las Vegas to the burial site, without intermediate stops, consistent with the claim that his death had created an immediate crisis, requiring rapid response from the criminals involved. DNA analysis of trace evidence found with the remains confirmed the identity through comparison with samples provided by family members, while also revealing the presence of foreign DNA that matched samples taken from Danny Costello and Marcus Webb during their arrests. This evidence provided crucial corroboration for the prosecution's case, linking the defendants directly to the crime scene and supporting charges of conspiracy, evidence tampering, and accessory to manslaughter. The discovery of Tony's remains also prompted renewed investigation into other missing persons cases that might be connected to Marchetti's organization, as the successful resolution of the Delgado case provided a template for solving similar crimes. Police began reviewing cold cases involving gamblers who had disappeared under suspicious circumstances, looking for patterns that might indicate additional victims of the loan shark operation. For Detective Martinez, the successful recovery represented the culmination of years of patient investigation and the validation of modern forensic techniques applied to historical crimes. The case demonstrated how persistence, scientific analysis, and strategic pressure on criminal networks could solve even decades-old mysteries, providing both justice for victims and closure for families who had never stopped seeking answers. The media attention surrounding the discovery brought renewed focus to the problems of gambling addiction and predatory lending practices that continued to plague Las Vegas and other gaming destinations. Tony's story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of desperate financial decisions and the criminal networks that exploited vulnerable people seeking quick solutions to overwhelming problems. The legal proceedings that would follow the discovery promised to be complex, involving multiple defendants with varying levels of culpability and sophisticated defense strategies designed to minimize individual responsibility for collective criminal activity. However, the physical evidence recovered from the desert site provided prosecutors with concrete proof that could support convictions even in cases where witness testimony might be challenged or contradicted. The courtroom was packed on a crisp January morning in 2022 as the trial of Marcus Webb and Danny Costello finally began, nearly 20 years after Tony Delgado's death in a Las Vegas casino parking garage. The case had attracted significant media attention, not only because of the lengthy investigation that had preceded it, but also because it highlighted the ongoing problems of gambling addiction and predatory lending that continued to destroy lives throughout Nevada. District Attorney Patricia Valdez had personally taken charge of the prosecution, recognizing the case's importance as both a test of the justice system's ability to solve cold cases and a statement about accountability for crimes against vulnerable people. Webb's deteriorating health had complicated the trial proceedings, as his terminal cancer diagnosis required frequent medical breaks and raised questions about his fitness to stand trial. His defense team argued that their client's condition made it impossible for him to adequately participate in his own defense, while prosecutors maintained that justice for Tony Delgado could not be delayed by a defendant's health problems. Judge Robert Harrison ultimately ruled that the trial would proceed with accommodations for Webb's medical needs, but warned that any attempts to manipulate the process would result in contempt charges. The prosecution's case rested heavily on Danny Costello's detailed testimony about the events of March 15, 2002, supplemented by physical evidence recovered from the desert burial site and financial records that established the timeline of Tony's gambling losses and subsequent debt to Marchetti's organization. Valdez methodically presented evidence that painted a picture of a predatory lending operation that had systematically exploited desperate gamblers, using violence and intimidation to enforce collection when other methods failed. Costello's testimony was emotionally devastating for the Delgado family, who were hearing the details of Tony's final hours for the first time. His account of Tony's desperation and fear, his pleas for more time to repay his debts, and his final declaration that he would rather die than face his family's disappointment, brought Maria to tears and forced Sofia and Miguel to confront the reality of their father's state of mind during his last night alive. The testimony also revealed the calculating coldness with which Webb and Costello had decided to conceal Tony's accidental death, rather than seek medical help that might have saved his life. Webb's defense strategy focused on minimizing his role in Tony's death, while portraying him as a low-level employee who had been following orders from Eddie Marchetti. His attorney, veteran criminal defender James Rothstein, argued that Webb had acted in panic after Tony's accidental fall and that his subsequent actions, while legally questionable, did not constitute murder. The defense attempted to characterize Tony's death as a tragic accident that had been compounded by poor decisions made under extreme stress, rather than the result of a criminal enterprise that regularly used violence to collect debts. The prosecution's star witness proved to be Dr. Amanda Foster, the forensic anthropologist who had supervised the recovery of Tony's remains. Her detailed analysis of the skeletal evidence provided scientific support for Costello's account of the events, while also revealing additional details about the circumstances of Tony's death that corroborated witness testimony. Dr. Foster's explanation of the head trauma patterns and their consistency with the described fall from standing height onto concrete was particularly compelling to jurors who needed to understand the medical reality behind the legal charges. Eddie Marchetti's separate trial had been delayed due to his attorney's health problems, but his presence loomed over the Webb-Costello proceedings as prosecutors presented evidence of the systematic criminal enterprise that had created the conditions leading to Tony's death. Wiretap evidence and financial records showed that Marchetti had operated a sophisticated loan shark operation that deliberately targeted vulnerable gamblers, using violence as a routine collection tool when other methods failed to produce payment. The emotional impact of the trial extended beyond the courtroom, as media coverage brought national attention to the problems of gambling addiction and the criminal networks that exploited people suffering from this disease. Tony's story became a symbol of the devastating consequences that could result from the combination of addiction, desperation, and predatory lending, prompting calls for stronger regulation of both the gambling industry and the alternative lending markets that served people excluded from traditional financial services. Maria Delgado's victim impact statement provided one of the trial's most powerful moments as she described the 19 years of uncertainty and grief that had shaped her family's life since Tony's disappearance. Her testimony about Sofia's delayed heart surgery, Miguel's behavioral problems, and the family's financial struggles created a human context for the legal proceedings that helped jurors understand the full scope of the defendant's criminal actions. Her call for justice was dignified but firm, emphasizing that while nothing could bring Tony back, holding his killers accountable was essential for both her family's healing and society's protection. The jury's deliberations lasted 3 days, reflecting the complexity of the charges and the emotional weight of the evidence they had heard. Their questions to the judge focused primarily on the legal definitions of manslaughter versus murder, and the degree to which the defendant's actions after Tony's death should influence their assessment of culpability for the death itself. The lengthy deliberation period created additional stress for the Delgado family, who had already waited nearly 2 decades for this moment of accountability. The verdict, when it finally came, provided partial satisfaction for the family's long quest for justice. Danny Costello was convicted on charges of involuntary manslaughter, conspiracy, and tampering with evidence, while Marcus Webb was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter, conspiracy, and evidence tampering. The distinction between voluntary and involuntary manslaughter reflected the jury's assessment that Webb had struck the blow that killed Tony, while Costello had participated in the cover-up without directly causing the fatal injury. Judge Harrison's sentencing reflected the seriousness of the crimes, while acknowledging the passage of time and the defendant's varying levels of culpability. Costello received a sentence of 12 to 20 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after serving the minimum term. Webb, whose terminal cancer diagnosis meant he was unlikely to serve his full sentence, received 15 to 25 years, with the judge noting that his role in striking Tony and his leadership in the subsequent cover-up warranted the harsher punishment. The sentences brought mixed reactions from the Delgado family and victim advocacy groups, with some feeling that the punishment was inadequate given the decades of suffering the crimes had caused. However, legal experts noted that the charges and sentences were appropriate given the accidental nature of Tony's death and the challenges of prosecuting a 20-year-old case. The convictions represented a significant victory for cold case investigation techniques and demonstrated that justice could still be achieved even when crimes had been concealed for decades. Eddie Marchetti's separate trial, scheduled for later in 2022, promised to provide additional accountability for the criminal enterprise that had created the conditions leading to Tony's death. Prosecutors indicated that they would seek enhanced penalties based on Marchetti's role as the leader of a criminal organization and his responsibility for creating the violent culture that had made Tony's death inevitable. The upcoming proceedings would also provide opportunities to address other potential victims of the loan shark operation and to seek justice for families who had suffered similar losses. The resolution of Tony's case also prompted changes in law enforcement approaches to missing persons investigations, particularly those involving gambling-related disappearances. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department established new protocols for investigating cases where gambling debts might be a factor, while also creating better coordination mechanisms with other agencies to track patterns of violence associated with illegal lending operations. For the Delgado family, the trial's conclusion marked not an ending, but a transition to a new phase of their healing process. While the convictions provided validation of their long struggle for justice, they also forced the family to confront the reality that Tony was never coming home, and that their years of hope for his return had been based on circumstances that had never existed. The knowledge that he had died accidentally while trying to solve their financial problems added layers of complexity to their grief that would require ongoing processing and support. The case's resolution also provided closure for Detective Martinez and other law enforcement professionals who had worked on the investigation over the years. The successful prosecution demonstrated that persistence and modern forensic techniques could solve even the most challenging cold cases, providing hope for other families waiting for answers about missing loved ones. The Delgado case became a model for other jurisdictions dealing with similar investigations, showing how patience, scientific analysis, and strategic pressure on criminal networks could produce results even decades after crimes had been committed. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following Anthony Delgado's story. We'll see you in the next video. The desert may have kept Tony's secret for 19 years, but truth, like water in drought, always finds a way to surface. In the end, it wasn't justice that was delayed, it was simply taking the long way home.